Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, August 2nd, 2025, and today we are going to be taking a look at the 2026 Senate elections and making an election prediction roughly a year and a half out, less than that actually, ahead of the 2026 midterm elections. Now, it's been a bit of news in the Senate space since I last made my prediction at the beginning of July. We have an announcement from Roy Cooper and some races shaking up across the country that might end up being more interesting by the time we get closer to November, and potentially more and more competitive, and in some cases, less and less competitive. The national stage here is set by 35 toss-up Senate seats right now. Obviously, the majority of these seats will not be toss-ups, but for right now, we're working with Democrats starting out with 34 seats not up for re-election and Republicans at about 31. Now, coming off the last set of Senate elections in 2024, Republicans got to the advantage of 53 seats in the U.S. Senate to the Democratic Party's 47. It's an advantage that gives the Republican Party a pretty comfortable margin in terms of governance right now going into the first 2 years of Donald Trump's second administration. But 2026 is largely seen as a stepping stone, not necessarily the end-all be-all for Democrats, as 2026 could potentially set up Democrats for a majority in the 2028 Senate elections, as they see 2026 as a largely unwinnable race, at least when it comes down to the national stage. And a big reason for that is because you're working with a number of states that are going to be already very lopsided in favor of the Republican Party. If we're just to give you a general understanding of where the map is right now, what I'm going to do is just characterize all of the states that are currently controlled by Republicans and Democrats across the country. You'll see exactly why the Senate math here doesn't really show that much that makes sense, especially for Democrats looking to reclaim the majority in 2026. In terms of the states that I will actually cover as states that are more competitive than safe means these are states that are won by the Democratic Party or the Republican Party by about 15 points or more, you really start to see that the map does dwindle and narrow down in terms of opportunity for the National Democratic Party. States like Alaska might be more competitive, but Democrats certainly aren't going to be winning there. It just means that it's going to be less than a safe margin. But as I go across the map here and characterize all of the states that I expect to be decided by margins of less than 15 points, again, it still finds Democrats in a difficult position about finding a pathway to a governing majority at the end of the 2026 midterms. Out of the 14 toss-up seats here, Republicans just need 5 out of the 14 in order to maintain Senate control, and that's with Vice President J.D. Vance breaking the tie. If Democrats want an actual majority, they would need to win 8, not 8 actually, more than that, I'm not doing the math on that right, 10 out of the 14 toss-up seats in order to get them to 51 to 49, which becomes increasingly more difficult as the election continues onward. So Democrats being at 41, Republicans at 45. I already mentioned a state like Alaska is not going to be won by the Democratic Party, but rather by the Republican Party, just by a narrower margin than what you might expect. As we go through these likely states we expect to be decided between 5 and 15 percentage points, you start to see exactly how the math becomes more difficult as we go from parts of the nation, and you'll see that the Republican Party comes into this with an outright and unequivocal advantage in the Senate elections, unlike many previous years. The Senate math typically does, though, favor the GOP. They often do better in the states with more rural populations and smaller groups that are of equal proportion in the U.S. Senate, and so it is interesting, at bare minimum, that Democrats are even in competitive range in 2028, but point being, in 2026, you really aren't going to see it happen, and I'll show you why in just a moment. So amongst the states that we already expect to be likely for the Republican Party, it pretty much axes out the Republicans in almost every single, Democrats in almost every single way. Alaska is one of those states that we can expect. Republicans will probably win it with Dan Sullivan by 11 or 12 points. Now, it could be more competitive if Mary Peltola decides to run. I don't imagine she runs for Senate. I think she'll run for governor, but should she decide to make the race a little bit more competitive, who knows what happens there. But as of right now, I fully expect the Republican Party to have a pretty solid victory in the state. Texas, even with Paxton, I mean, it depends on who the Democrats nominate. It looks like it's going to be an all-out frenzy in the Democratic primary in Texas. But as of right now, there's a few Democrats there that might be able to make that race more competitive. But for Ken Paxton, he'll certainly make it, worse for the GOP. But to the degree that a state that Donald Trump won by 14 points is all of a sudden going to go to the Democratic Party in 2026, at least right now, it's difficult to see. Doesn't mean it's impossible with the right tuning of the message and the right candidate in the state and the right collapse on Paxton's side, like you might see should he get through to the nomination? Possibly, but that's a lot of hoops to jump through for a hypothetical right now, current state of the race, likely Republican state. Now, former Governor Pete Ricketts and now Senator Pete Ricketts is running in the state of Nebraska. It's an interesting race, not because he's choosing to run, but rather because an independent candidate, Dan Osborne, who got within 6 points of being elected to the U.S. Senate last cycle, is running yet again in the 2026 midterm elections. Now, he's running against a better candidate than Deb Fischer. And I don't think the race will be as competitive unless 2026 ends up being slightly more for the Democratic Party than where it is currently today. Either way, though, I expect the Republicans will win the state of Nebraska by anywhere from 5 to 10 points. Obviously, a much more massive reduction than what they're used to on the presidential stage. We typically know that Donald Trump won this state by 21 points against Kamala Harris. Now, when it comes down to the Senate math here, what we're looking at is that Nebraska, brass tacks, is going to be a Republican state. Democrats/independents have inroads that are slightly possible, slightly in the realm of possibility in 2026. I honestly believe it isn't going to happen. Nebraska, likely Republican state. Now we have the remaining states that we can characterize as likely for the GOP. I think there's 3 states here that really put the Republicans over the top because it doesn't even give Democrats the opportunity to tie the U.S. Senate. Iowa and Ohio currently have Republicans. Joni Ernst in Iowa, there's high expectation that she decides to retire, that she decides to step back from the U.S. Senate. That has not yet been confirmed. I actually think she stands to be one of the weaker nominees in this state. But the point is that Iowa, as a state, will still likely vote for the GOP, especially given that Donald Trump won the state by about 13 points in the last election. John Husted, who is the former lieutenant governor of Ohio, now incumbent U.S. senator, he's in this position. He replaced J.D. Vance. His race is up in 2026. I don't expect this race to even be competitive unless Sherrod Brown decides to run for it. And even then, I think the Republican Party might still have at the beginning an upper hand coming off the last election of having won that Senate race. And so while 2026 might be an entirely different year, it could be very risky. Ohio has a presidential election, as do every other state, in 2028. That would move this Senate election to 2028. So let's say Sherrod Brown wins it in 26 in order to win the full term. Because J.D. Vance was elected in 2022, you'd be up again in 2028. So it'd be very difficult to see back-to-back victories, especially since Sherrod Brown went down in the presidential election in 2024, but we'll see. Ohio right now, likely Republican state, and that already puts Republicans at a 50 majority, meaning J.D. Vance already breaks the tie. But bad news for Democrats, you also have to add in Florida. So that brings Republicans to 51 seats across the country in safe, likely, and uncontested seats, meaning that at bare minimum, Democrats would need to move the window from not only winning competitive states, which they probably will do in 2026, but less than competitive states, states that are likely for the GOP, states that aren't even in the realm of possibility right now for the Democratic Party, that they would need to invest in heavily. The question is, can they do it? It's possible. Flukes happen in elections, but even then you bring the Republicans down to 50 and J.D. Vance still breaks the tie. They end up in the advantage. So it is difficult to see how, of these remaining toss-up seats, even if everything goes right for the Democratic Party, it is still difficult to get Democrats over that hurdle of 51 seats, given that they're competing in states that are pretty lopsided in favor of the Republican Party. So that brings us to Democrats at 41. Democrats, of course, have their own likely states, states like New Mexico, states like Virginia, states like New Jersey, that I believe, plainly put, and New Hampshire, arguably with Chris Pappas, that these states probably won't be touched too heavily by the Republican Party. I do think that it is difficult to see these states becoming safe in 2026, even if they were likely states in 2024, with the exception of New Hampshire. I think all of these states we could see on the upper echelon of being 11, 12, 13 points, sure, but I don't think you're going to see them as 15-point plus states unless something major happens that collapses the GOP nominees in all of these states. New Jersey certainly has been moving in a direction that makes it more competitive rather than not. New Hampshire, Virginia, New Mexico, nothing new there, especially on the Senate level. These states typically vote for the Democratic Party, and Democrats can rely on their support in 2026. But at the same time, I don't think these races will be decided by 15 points or more. And so that brings us down to 4 remaining toss-up states: Maine, Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia. Right now, Republicans currently hold 2, Democrats currently hold 2, and both parties are heavily targeting both of these states to the greatest degree. Democrats and Republicans across this country know that the 4 main key races in 2026 will be fought in the 4 that I just mentioned. Not in Ohio, not in Virginia, not in New Hampshire, not in Texas, not in Florida, not in New Mexico, but in Michigan, in Maine, in North Carolina, and Georgia. In terms of incumbents, you have Gary Peters in Michigan, who announced that he was going to retire. He's not running for re-election. He won by about 1.5 points in 2020. In Maine, Susan Collins, she won by about 8 points. Republican incumbent in Maine won by 8 points in 2020. 6 years prior, won by 35 points. So certainly a trajectory that benefits the Democratic Party, but still a lot of Democrats are apprehensive about running against her. There's no clear frontrunner in Maine on the Democratic side. And arguably too in Michigan, it's a very contested primary. You have Abdul Said, you have Mallory McMorrow, you have Haley Stevens. Very competitive race on the Michigan Democratic side as well. In North Carolina, pretty much cleared field on both sides. Tom Tillis, the senator who's been representing the state for over a decade, decided that he was going to run for re-election. Then Donald Trump went against him on Truth Social, then dropped out of the race. Now Michael Whatley, who is the Republican former RNC chair, or I guess now still the RNC chair, is running for Senate in this state, clearing the field against Governor Roy Cooper, the former Democratic governor who just left office earlier this year in the state of North Carolina. In Georgia, you have Jon Ossoff. Brian Kemp is trying to get Derek Dooley, the former coach of the Tennessee Volunteers at UTK, looking at Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, and Maine. It doesn't seem like Georgia, I think, is probably the weakest state right now for the GOP out of the four that I just mentioned. For the Democrats, I'd say right now, Maine is probably the weakest state for them across the four. But of course, these states are going to be contested and they're going to be fought for. I'm very interested to see what develops over the coming weeks and months. But to start off, I'm actually going to be changing one of my characterizations from my last video. That is in the state of Michigan. I had it as a likely Democratic state. I want to move this state down to being a lean Democratic state, and I want you to hear me out. With the lack of a clear frontrunner on the Democratic side, and no clear indication how all of these candidates would do in a general election, they all have very different sections of the state that they would do very well in, as well as the fact they sort of represent different factions, right? Haley Stevens seems to be on opposing sides from Abdul Said in terms of overall politics and in terms of progressive versus centrist movement. Mallory McMorrow, who is not a U.S. representative, who had not run statewide before, is a state senator who seems to be somewhere around the middle too, but no clear frontrunner and no clear emerging candidate on the Democratic side makes me believe it gives more leeway for someone like the Republican Mike Rogers to do better in this Michigan race. Now, I do think Democrats in Michigan will largely be saved by the fact that 2026 is 2026. Democrats are doing better. They're doing better in the generic ballot. They're winning back general, party affiliation across the country. Generally speaking, Democrats are in a better position today than they were in the last election. But that doesn't mean Michigan is going to be a likely state. And I think with the lack of clear direction right now, Michigan stands to be lean for the Democratic Party. But I also think that Georgia joins the fray as a lean Democratic state. This was also in my last prediction, but I still stand by it today, even as Brian Kemp gets some of the weaker candidates out of the race, who I didn't even believe would be the nominee by the time you reach the election. Jon Ossoff is just incredibly hard to beat. He's running a very strong campaign. He has raised a crap ton of money, the most amount of money raised for any candidate running in the 2026 cycle so far. I mean, $11 million each quarter is a lot in a state, especially for a candidate who raised $150 million in the 2020 election. I mean, he knew how to raise money. He knew how to invest and get all of that worth, because what he did was take a race where he was largely perceived as a sacrificial lamb in 2019 when he announced he was running for Senate and now was elected to the U.S. Senate. Georgia right now, Democrats, I believe, are on a much better pathway than Republicans, especially given the margin in the last presidential election. While the nation shifted 6.5 points to the right, Georgia shifted by about 2.5 points to the right, even less than that when you look at the actual breakdown. And that matters. That makes a huge difference in the way that Georgia would likely vote in this midterm election, and I think ultimately benefits the Democratic Party. But this brings us down to our two remaining Republican seats, Susan Collins in Maine and Tom Tillis in North Carolina. Now, I still stand by my prediction that Maine, as of now, still goes to Susan Collins. I think she's unpopular, and I think she's in a really bad place. But no strong Democrat, or known Democrat, because I don't know how some of these candidates that don't have name ID would perform, but my chances are not well. Looking at Maine and looking at the list of candidates that could run, I do think that there are Democrats that could get in this race, could fire up the party, and could take on Susan Collins, and even then get to a point where Maine is competitive. But as of now, Susan Collins and her electoral juggernaut history does make me believe, as of now, she stands to be the favorite. Do Democrats have a shot without a big-name candidate? Sure. I think there's still a lot of disaffected Democrats in Maine that previously voted for Susan Collins, even in 2020, that will not vote for her in 2026. But she's tough. And while she may go down, it will take the right type of Democrat to do it, and it won't be by a lot. This race, despite the state voting Democratic in every election on the presidential level for a very long time since Bill Clinton, it will be a state that Susan Collins, as of now, holds the upper hand advantage, but Democrats certainly can take her down with the right nominee. The final state to look at is the state of North Carolina. It's a state that Democrats believe with Roy Cooper they are able to win, and to that point, I agree. I think this is a state that can be decided by upwards of 2, 3, maybe 4 points if things go in the right direction for the Democratic Party. Do I think that they win this state by 6 or 7? No, because Cooper didn't even do that as governor, despite being one of the most popular Democratic governors in the country. I do think he makes this race significantly more competitive, and as a state that hasn't voted on the presidential level or on the Senate level for a Democrat since before Obama was president, you have to think that North Carolina would be very difficult for Democrats, and it arguably has been. North Carolina has not had a Senate election that has coincided with the Democratic wave year since 2008. I kid you not. It has been tremendously difficult for Democrats to do well because of the circumstances surrounding the year and that North Carolina just historically votes for the Republican Party. But Roy Cooper might be the one to overcome that. This race right now, I'd say lean for the Democratic Party. I expect Roy Cooper to beat Michael Whatley by a margin of around 2 points today. That might expand, that might decrease. We'll see over the next weeks and months. But as of now, North Carolina, a lean Democratic state. And so that brings our final map here at 52 seats for the Republican Party and 48 for the Democratic Party. Democrats hold on to Michigan and Georgia. They lose Maine. Republicans already have Maine, but they flip North Carolina. That stands to be the only flip of the map. Now, this math makes it more difficult for Democrats to win back the Senate majority in 2028. Ideally, they would have Maine if they want an easier pathway, but they have a realm of possibility where if they win the presidency, they can break the tie 50-50. But as of now, 52 seats for the Republicans, 48 for the Democrats. Democrats win more competitive states than Republicans, but ultimately, the Senate math is lopsided in favor of one political party, and it's not the Democratic Party, and that gives them the upper hand through the rest of the decade. Republicans 52, Democrats 48. Room for improvement on the Democratic side, but only time will tell if they get to that point or not. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.